Can everyone see my screen? Awesome. So first, I want to build back to what we left off yesterday, because we have stopped without discussing the bottom half of this debate. So just as a quick recap for those who need a reminder, we have previously discussed the top half of the motion. This House believes that governments should abandon the strategy of decapitation. And we have concluded that on the top half, OO is currently in a lead up relative to OG, because they are winning the clash on what is the aftermath of this policy on terror organizations to a larger extent than what OG is able to push in the other two clashes on feasibility and collateral harm. We then ask ourselves, where do we position CG and CO in this comparison? So CG doubled down a lot on why decapitation is ineffective. And they give many, many reasons why decapitation is ineffective, as well as remind us the weighing that OG gave, that inefficacy of decapitation is logically prior to the rest of the debate. Question for the audience then. Who thinks CG is currently winning OO? Okay, who thinks CG is currently winning OG? Do we need a more thorough recap? Do people understand the question?
Again, we can show the previous slides also, just to,
Yeah, of course. So as a reminder, this is the content that we had on the top. So what do you think about CG's strategy? Where do you think they place well in the debate? How about I start with a simpler question? Do you think they proved their extension? Are you convinced by the CG mechanisms that decapitation is ineffective? Anyone who is or isn't convinced that wants to explain why?
Should I take it?
You go ahead.
Okay, so I believe like CG has quite effectively proved that what OO was kind of forcing that it's like a one person. Here we are talking about, look, who that person going to be, who that leader is, identifying them itself is a challenge, considering that, look, they never come to the picture. So that itself proved that, we never get to know the exact person. So we will always be, have multiple faces, like, same goes in like Afghan, this tragedy of this 26/11, that we came to know about Osama bin Laden quite later, and there were so many faces initially. So just getting that person seems easy, that we have only one target, but effectively that's so much hard to identify that one person itself.
Okay. So do you think they prove decapitation is ineffective? Sounds like you think they do, right?
Yeah, because the idea is decapitation is for a particular set of people, and if getting those people itself is difficult, then itself it's decapitation is ineffective.
Okay. Do you think they prove decapitation is never effective?
Not because if we have a mechanism to get the correct person, the correct leader, then it's a effective, seemingly effective, position to take.
So what is the harm that they prove?
What they prove is that, that within decapitation, one of the important, part is to really get that leader, and that itself is really tricky to get into.
Okay. So do you think it's enough to place them over OO?
Uh, I think yes, because the point is that, in general, if you look at the movements, especially we're talking about terrorism, which is not like a structured, organized army military where the leader. These are always the movements which have, they're people led, but also the organization keep shifting, changing, and it's not always the leader, or they keep changing. So if that strategy itself is locating that person is difficult, this whole decapitation will not work.
Okay. So who thinks they're winning OO? Who thinks they're losing to OO? Are we still in the majority don't think phase? What do you think of the weighing? Is there a case logically prior to the rest of the debate?
Could you repeat the question?
Do you think the efficacy question is indeed logically prior to the rest of the debate, as they claim it to be? As a reminder, this is the OO content.
I think looking at the first part itself, there is a lot of talk about that one person, even from OG side to O. So that, for me, it seems is a central part of the debate.
Mm-hmm. What is the impact CG proves that you guys think is winning OO?
Uh, Look, what CG done is that because there is no, I guess Aditi has a question. Aditi, go ahead. I think she should.
No, I was just answering that question. So, I think when they say that even if they kill their leader, it will not necessarily stop terrorism because there's someone else who's going to replace him. is something that is not well rebutted.
Mhm. Okay. And why does it win 0-0?
Primarily because OO's case is leaning on the fact that, if we focus on the one guy and killing that one guy is easy, then decapitation essentially works. And their case lacks relevancy to the major contention of the debate itself.
So what does it do to the 0-0 impacts?
They fall flat.
Do they fall flat? Okay, hold on. I also see in chat, some people think it might flip 0-0. Can anyone explain why it might flip 0-0? So as a reminder, in the series of workshops you guys have watched from Korea World, there was a video by Harish explaining rebuttals and how to assess them, in which we want to ask ourselves the extent of the refutation as well. There are rebuttals that flip a point. There are rebuttals that make a point fall flat. And there are rebuttals that mitigate a point, leave some of it standing, but not entirely take it down. Can you identify, of those three things, which does the CG extension do? Does it flip 0-0? Does it make 0-0 fall flat? Or does it mitigate 0-0?
I think something very similar to mitigation and or flipping, like a mixture of those two.
Can you explain the mixture? How is it a mitigation and how is it a flip?
Mitigation basically because they say that, Bin Laden being a solitary example of this situation just means that, the exception is not the rule. And thus they do agree that sometimes it might work, but it's not something that will always work. So, yeah.
Okay, so that's why it's a mitigation. Why would it be a flip?
Because they attack OO's primary claim of the primary leader's decapitation being important in the debate. Like, they essentially prove that the singular leader is not what is the primary driver of a terrorist organization. And even without that one
Do
leader,
they prove the leader is not a primary mover of a terror organization?
my bad, I didn't really, yeah.
So this is important. And I think this is a close but clear call where CG is going to lose to 0-0 and win OG. And the point I want to be make here is about how we evaluate engagement extensions or extensions that are made on a link that in nature is very mitigatory. CG is indeed in this case not flipping 0-0. They are not able to co-opt any of the 0-0 impacts and show why they happen more on their side. Nor are they able to make 0-0 fall entirely flat, because as 0-0 points out and they concede, at least in some cases, decapitation works. And in those cases, when decapitation works, 0-0 still gets their impacts, because CG does not rebut that when decapitation works, it's quite effective. They only say it almost never works. The key word here is almost. It almost never works, but sometimes it does. And when it does, 0-0 wins. When it does, 0-0 has benefits and CG has none. What happens when it doesn't work? What are the harms? Does CG show any price we pay for trying to decapitate and failing?
Nope.
No.
Hence, CG on this extension alone cannot win over OO. They are purely mitigatory. They do not show any harm. They effectively show OO is losing a lot of its benefits because they managed to show most of it will not accrue. But they don't do sufficiently to prove it will never accrue, nor do they show any concrete harm for us to not find the few instances in which the damage accrues worth it. Do we have questions on the CG-OO comparison? What do you think on GovBench? Is CG winning or losing to OG in your opinion? Can CG win OG on mitigation alone? What do you think? So I hear in chat the opinion that they need at least some constructive to win. Any more opinions?
I feel like OG like puts a lot of harms when the like decapitation works. Like when they go ahead and tell that it will only lead to worse leaders and things like that. Even when they don't prove that it's ineffective, but they still prove that it's going to put a lot of harms which CG doesn't do.
Mm-hmm. Anyone think CG takes it over OG? I actually think CG takes it over OG. I think CG takes it over OG for two reasons. One is less important, but I'll go over it quickly because it's the faster one. OG give themselves the weighing of logical priority. Hence, unlike OO, which challenges this weighing and says it's not really, implicitly they say it in the POI, it's not really logically prior because it's enough to have some instances for our impacts to stand. OG concedes the CG metric here. But this is the smaller reason why I'm leaning CG. The bigger reason is, I just think CG did a much better job in rebuttal. How do we assess this? Because this is one of the harder things to evaluate in extensions. As a reminder, holistic adjudication, one of our three pillars, we do not discriminate between constructive and destructive material. Whichever the team chooses to brand their material as is still material that should be equally credited and could stand as an extension. In this case, the CG extension is a rebuttal extension. Why is it difficult to assess the value of this rebuttal extension? And why is it still probably enough to win OG? And how can we reach this conclusion? It is difficult because it is not enough to win OO. And on the other hand, OG is also not winning OO. Rebuttal extensions are usually the easiest to assess when a team transitively wins over their top half by effectively rebutting the threat and then taking it over their top half. But what happens when you give good rebuttals, much better than your top half rebuttals, that are insufficient to take down the opposing bench? Can you still win over your top half on engagement alone? The answer is yes. But then the judge needs to have a very coherent idea of what value to place on this engagement. Because not all new rebuttal, and not even all new good rebuttal, is winning top half. It has to be assessed comparatively against the positive contributions OG gave. How do we do that? Does anyone have an idea? We're in another apples and oranges situation. How do we compare OG's constructive against CG's destructive? Anyone has any ideas of what tools they can use for this? So you're going in the right direction. You're trying to think back of how we evaluate the persuasiveness of arguments via their likelihood, their impact, and their relevance. How do we do that when comparing negative and positive material? Anupriya, you have an idea?
Yeah, I think we also look at all these three pillars, but at the very same time, we do not give equal importance to all three of them, because the comparative here is between, as we have already stated, apples and oranges. So one is completely destructive material and one is trying to be constructive. So we start first of all with whether is there a likelihood of each thing happening, and then on that basis we also check into the relevance of whether it's applicable in this line of argument. So not giving equal importance to all three pillars, but still using these three pillars to gauge either side of the argument.
Yeah, that is very much the correct direction of how you want to go about this. So as we explained in the previous time, when we assess the quality of an argument, we try to assess where it positions on these three different metrics to assess the overall volume of, when you quantify all of these three, how much persuasiveness in total do we aggregate. And this is often a tricky thing to do on intuition alone. But it does tell us that the volume is the same, whether it is above the scale or below the scale, whether it is positive or negative. The question is only the extent of difference it does in the room. Or in other words, the question we always want to ask ourselves when comparing between top half and bottom half of the same bench is the following. Which did a better job in convincing me that they are winning over the opposing bench? Obviously, it is easiest to do when one of them is winning the opposing bench and one of them is losing to the opposing bench. But what do we do when both governments win the opposing bench or when both governments lose to the opposing bench? We simply ask ourselves, who did a better job in this winning or losing situation? If both of them are winning, we are asking, who is winning more? Who is winning 0-0 on a close call and who is winning them on a clear call? Or in this case, if we are comparing them to 0-0, which wins both OG and CG at the moment, who is losing to them less? Who made the margin of difference closer? Who got us as the panel closer to being persuaded that their side might be winning? Remember, comparative, not absolutes. On an absolute, it will be impossible to answer this question because neither of them did enough to convince us they are winning over 0-0. But which did a better job in making us contemplate that they might be winning 0-0? What do you think? Before we had the very thorough discussion to understand why the CG mitigation is only a mitigation and does not completely nullify and make OO fall flat. A lot of you are thinking CG might be winning OO, right?
Yeah.
This should be your intuitive guiding direction at this. It's not yet a decisive explanation, an actual explanation I'll give in a second, the way you want to present it in an OA. But the basic hunch you should have that CG is doing a better job than OG here is based on the initial thought you had that they might be winning OO. Even if you ended up reaching the conclusion that they are not winning OO, the fact that they are very close to should tell you that they have probably done a better job in closing the gap than OG did. In this particular case, the explanation I would give is precisely that. Engagement is not inherently better or worse than constructive. The question I ask myself is, did CG's engagement do a better job in harming OO than the OG constructive did? And in this case, the answer is yes. While CG did not decisively win OO and are still losing for being mitigatory, they did cause significant harm to the OO case, proving the significant implausibility of their impact to the extent that leaves OO standing in only a fraction of the cases, making them still more convincing than no harm, but very little convincing. Very little remains standing. Whereas when I'm comparing OG to OO, OG is in much less of a harmful position to OO. It's not a close call between OG and OO. OG is not engaging OO basically at all. And OO proved their case significantly better than OG. Hence, despite OG having a constructive case, the margin of difference between what remains standing of their constructive and what they leave standing from OO is very large, because OO's constructive is much, much better. OO's constructive is only a bit better than CG's destructive, leaving only a fraction of their impact standing. Are there questions on this point? Okay. Let's discuss CO. CO gives the extension that decapitation leads to less collateral harm, similar to a clash both OG and OO had. Remember when OG said decapitation leads to collateral harm because terrorists surround themselves by human shields, and OO says, but it leads to less collateral harm than a full-on war. So these are the new mechanisms CO provides. It's likely that the alternative would be wars or drones or other forms of worse intervention. One, because leaders have to respond somehow to a terror attack. It is a political suicide to let terror attacks let slide. People are scared and pressuring you to respond. So you are in the lookout to do something. If you can't decapitate, you would drone the enemy or send foot on ground. Two, because there still is a living leader in the terror organization who could do more attacks that could escalate, because often these attacks involve fights from people on the ground that develop into full-on conflict. Three, because countries that want to end terror will need to find a different solution. And the different solution would usually involve, if you can't eliminate the leader, try and eliminate another part of the chain. So bomb tunnels that are used for smuggling weapons or infrastructure and so on. All of these are massive in size and spread across much wider space, and therefore usually involve more human shields and more people who can get hurt. Fourthly, because the leader has to be well hidden and is usually far from population centers. So they are not likely to involve a lot of collateral harm on their side when we try to decapitate, because they are far away from where majority of people are, and therefore can't be surrounded by too many human shields. Question: do you think CO proved their point on collateral harm better than OO? I think we would probably all agree yes. Do you think they are winning OO? Reminder, this is the OO material. Okay, we have one yes. Any more thoughts? Okay, we have two yeses, one no. Okay. Anyone who thinks CO is winning OO and wants to explain why? Anyone? Aditi, maybe? Silence. Okay, anyone who thinks CO is losing to OO and wants to explain why?
Mainly because all of the harms, like all of the things that they prove, the CEO proved, they do impact it more in their speech, in their content. But I think a lot of it has already came from the over speech, and there is nothing new in terms of any other arguments and any other argument constructive. It's mostly all of the things that already O has proven to you, and just the CEO proves to me in a more better way that okay, why this is happening, but this O have already proven to me that it's going to happen. So yeah.
Okay, interesting. Aditi, what do you think?
Yeah, I think CO wins because some of the points made by OO, it's easy to effectively decapitate one person, etc., were made as a rebuttal to the points made by the OG, and such points were not made by CG other than why it will be ineffective. So if the CEO is able to give more analysis on why decapitation of one person is effective, I think they win because they didn't have to rebut these other points.
Did CO give more reasons why decapitation of one person is effective? You can unmute Aditi, I can see your
I
hand.
mean the less collateral harm.
Less collateral harm. Okay, and why is it winning OO?
I think like after the CG's speech, that was the only burden they had.
Why?
Because unlike OG, CG's main points were that decapitation is ineffective for like the following 3-4 reasons.
Okay. So I want to address a few things and then give you my poll on this. My perception is that CO is probably winning OO, but that it is not a very clear call because CO probably wants to weigh. But I'll explain shortly why. Firstly, I want to address the idea that OO already proved all of the claims, so even if CO proved them better, OO just had more. Here the question would still remain a comparative one, right? We are going back to our 3 pillars: comparative judgment, objective judgment, and holistic judgment. Comparative. We don't care if OO already proved something. The question is always who proves it better, who convinces us more of their side. If CO proved the point on collateral harm better than OO did in their one-line refutation, CO will get the credit for proving it better. At the same time, holistic adjudication, we do not undermine contributions OO gave just because they marked them as rebuttal. We do address what OO said in the refutation, which could amount to a constructive point had they branded it differently, the part on collateral harm. However, as we have discussed previously, this one line from OO is largely asserting that the counterfactual is going to be all-out war. They never prove this is the likely counterfactual. This is something CO uniquely proved. Then again, we are in an issue here, because whilst CO is proving better that collateral harm is likely to happen, OO has a different point unrelated to this one, which they do prove pretty well and mechanize, on harm to terror organizations. How do we compare between these two competing metrics? How do we know which is more important? Anyone has any ideas? Let's go then to the third pillar we have yet to use. We used holistic adjudication. We used comparative adjudication. Or sorry, actually not the pillars, but rather when we're comparing between them, we have the 3 metrics of a good argument or a convincing argument: analysis, impact, and relevance. Do you think either of them has significantly better analysis that is easy to compare? You can answer shamelessly. There are no bad answers. We are here to discuss. Do you think either OO or CO had better analysis?
CO had better analysis on like in terms of like proving why is it going to be less collateral harm.
On that, yes. But is their analysis better than the OO analysis on harm to terror organizations?
No.
So they have about similar degrees of analysis, only on different impacts. So let's ask the second question. Is any of the impacts more important trivially? Is one of the impacts intuitively much weaker than the other?
Can you repeat your question?
Yes, between the impact of harming terror organizations and their ability to commit terror and the impact of collateral harm of government's fight against terror, is either of the impacts significantly more important than the other, at least trivially so?
I think for me, collateral harm becomes like more important rather than like harming terror organizations.
Why?
So then that becomes the major like main point for me if I have to give it to CO or like if I have to select between CO and OO.
Why is collateral harm a bigger impact, you think, than harm to terror organizations?
Because collateral harm, when there would be less collateral harm, there would be like it would cause less harm to the humans, to the people who are around there, as like in terms of like innocent people, as in terms of like harming the terror organization. Like even when they goes and proves to me that this decapitation will significantly harm terror organization, I'm still likely to buy more into the idea of like collateral harm one.
Okay, I would say, I think probably both collateral harm and harm to terror organizations are quite high impact, and I can think of intuitive reasons for either on what is more important. I do agree that CO does better the immediate connection to the impact. There is an additional link that OO might want to add between the harm to terror organization and the less people dying. I think there's a bigger reason though, which would lead to me leaning CO. When discussing relevance, we want to ask ourselves what became relevant in the debate. What's the biggest vulnerability of OO at this point in the debate? Earlier, we said that CG heavily mitigated their impact. How are they able to do so?
Likelihood of capturing the main person. That's like probabilistically only say 5 or 10%. So 90% is already mitigated.
And is CO contingent on catching the person?
Yeah.
Do they need to prove that we effectively decapitate to prove that absent decapitation, the alternative would be worse? I think the real reason I would be leaning CO here, albeit it would be fair to say that they have more of the burden of weighing when both OO and CO have a well-analyzed, well-impacted case, is on relevance. CO's impact is just more standing in the debate in the way that the clashes in the debate played out. OO's impacts are entirely reliant on proving efficacy. If they don't catch the leader, they don't harm terror organizations. All of their harms accrue once the leader is caught. And hence, when CG proves that you will not catch them in majority of cases, it means that OO only get their impact in a fraction of the cases. Whereas CO does not need to prove even a single case being successful. All they need to prove is that if we can't try to decapitate, we would try worse methods, that the alternative is likely to be worse, independent of whether or not we succeed. Hence, their case remains applying and standing in all cases. Is this point clear?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any questions on this example as a whole?
So look, I have this. So look, the CO analysis of proving that even in this case, the collateral harm will be less. But look at to comparison to opening, OG. For example, the last point, where the leader might be hidden. I think it's equally, again, I can quote multiple examples from both the sides, that will they be, hidden in a populated area or not populated area. So it's like equal on both the sides. So had it been like 1, 2, 3, obviously the upper one is like not being covered earlier part, so it's can't like comparable. But the third point is quite comparable because the opening government already covered that they might be hidden in the populated area. So had it been like 3 points that they covered were already covered, like it could have gone the other way around.
The CO mechanisms, I
Yeah.
don't think they were covered by OO.
So look
I
at the
think
last point. So because the leader has to be well hidden, correct, and just to go up.
this is not a CO Mac, an OO Mac. This is an OG Mac.
Yeah. So look at the OG. Yes, exactly the point of the imposed collateral harm.
So this is not a CO repetition of OO, but a CO engagement to OG. It's only that their engagement is implicit in their case instead of being explicit in external rebuttal. This is how CO answers the OG Mac that says usually terror organization leaders surround themselves by human shields. CO says there are much more human shields when you are bombing large infrastructure and missile bases and so on, but also when you're hiding a leader, they are not likely to have many human shields because they have to be well hidden and far from population centers. So it's not a repetition of OO, it's a rebuttal to OG.
Yeah, but will you give it to CO? Because the point is that it could go like both way rounds. And considering they are last on the picture, so the OG doesn't really get the chance to rebut this, further.
So I do think I would still give it to CO for several reasons. First is, I do think this engagement, while it doesn't fully take down OG, and I can still believe there's an incentive to some sheltering of terror organization leaders behind human shields, OG never proves how many of them there are going to be. CO gives some reason, at least, to believe that there are not going to be many of them because they have to be far away from population centers. So I can still credit it as a mitigation, even if it is not a knockout rebuttal. But the second reason is I am looking at CO holistically, not just at this one transaction. So even if this one transaction, this rebuttal, falls flat, I would still need to look at the CO constructive analysis. And it does seem like they prove the alternative would be more collateral harm. They don't have to prove that only on government side there's collateral harm. Even if both sides have collateral harm, if they show the likely alternative has much more because it spreads into larger scope conflicts, they should still win on the metric of collateral harm on the ground of showing the comparatively bigger collateral harm. Does that answer the question? Okay. Are there any more questions on this demonstration? Okay, I will stop sharing now because I don't think we'll have time for another example. What I suggest to do, because I do have one prepared, is after this workshop is over, I will send Kamal from IDL the written example so that you can go over it at home to practice and try to come up with your call and justification. And I will then later also send a recorded OA of how I would call that debate so that you can compare your answers with my OA and send follow-up questions if you have any. Since we only have 5 minutes left, what I want to do is see if there are last remark questions on how to apply any of the tools we used here. Just to remind, we're using basically 2 basic questions. One, which argument is more persuasive on the 3 metrics of likelihood, importance, and relevance? And secondly, which of the three pillars can we borrow in our assistance of being objective, comparative, and holistic? Are there any questions on how we apply any of those in any complex calls?
I have a little question.
Yeah.
So when we're analyzing the likelihood of an argument and say that argument has not really received a proper refutation by any of the teams, but I, as a reasonable person, know that this particular argument is not very likely to happen. So how am I supposed to analyze that in that case?
Would use the same tools as I always use. I'd be comparative. I would insert myself to the debate to the same degree for each side. If I am stepping in favor of, say, to give an intuitive response that you think is very intuitive and the globally informed voter would think of it themselves and significantly harms government, this is fine as long as I'm doing the same symmetric step. For government, is there a very intuitive, obvious response to this or rebuilding on this that the globally informed voter would also immediately think of? In other words, I am trying to be equally interventionist. The other thing is also deriving from being comparative. Arguments are proven on a spectrum, not an absolute. I can buy the argument that is uncompelling to the degree that it was proven, even if it stands less because of the intuitive problem with it in real life. Some of the analysis can surely still be credited. Does this answer the question? You can also concretize it if there's a concrete example you have in mind.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Any other questions? Aditi Rai?
Hi. So I actually had a question on from the recorded video you had sent.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this debate on the rehabilitative form of punishment for prisons. So the question which is on clash which came up was, is it justified to leave people in prison once they no longer pose any danger to society? So when this becomes a clash, the question the burdens that the teams that prove are likely something like how to determine whether these people are actually ready to be rehabilitated and have served their punishment. So this is something that the sides would try to prove and disprove. So in such kind of debates, when a practical aspect like this is taken, so this is also the principled one, right?
Is the question how we compare a principal metric and a practical one?
Yeah.
It's another one of those apples and oranges comparisons. But honestly, the answer I would give is the same way you compare between two practical arguments that have just a different practical impact. I would still ask the exact same questions: likelihood, importance, and relevance. So in this, I would ask, one, who did a better job in proving their case to stand on the grounds of likelihood? Is the practical impact standing to a very large extent that I believe it happens in majority of cases or only in a fraction of them? Is the principle proven to be inherent and always standing, or is it proven to be sometimes on a case by case unjustified? The second I would ask is on importance. Is it a very important principle? Did the team do a good job in proving that it's a very important principle, one that we often prioritize? Similarly, is the impact very well impacted? And the third one is relevance. Which one is impacted more by the motion? Did any team do a better job by showing that the other side impact is marginal and does not change greatly because regardless of this policy, For example, I can always say that the harm of putting someone behind bars as a principled harm could still stand, even if I am releasing them based on rehabilitation status, because there will always be some time before when they actually are no longer a danger to society and when they end up being released on rehabilitation. So it's only now an argument of extent. Do we put them behind bars when they are innocent for a lot of time or for little time? As one example. Of course, ideally, I would want teams to say that. So given what I recall, the very little information I gave in that video on what each team gave and what each team said, I don't think you had enough information to deduce from this who is winning, because the answer would be it depends. The principled argument could win this debate, the practical argument could win this debate. But how to answer this it depends would come back to the exact same three questions. We compare between competing metrics always the same way, whether it is principle versus practical, principle versus principle, or practical versus practical. The other thing I would maybe look into, and this is in Milos's video on how to evaluate principle argumentation that you also had in the Korea judge training program, is that basically all arguments have a bit of both. And this is also how we do this comparison, because the practical also assumes a principle, right? Basically, the metric implicit in the practical argument is saying less crime is principally important because our principle is saving as many lives as possible. And the principled harm is also contingent on some practical thing happening in the world to enable it. It's contingent on showing that we indeed identify correctly who is rehabilitated and let them go. So both of them are standing on both a principled and a practical spectrum. I would try to compare which team is in a larger margin of difference from the other on the spectrum that it is winning. Is one more reliant or contingent on the other because the principle might be depending on the practical or vice versa? But this would be the broad answer to this. The specifics would be case by case depending on how teams analyzed it. Any more questions? Okay, I think we could call it a weekend. I will send a command